The rhythmic creak of the hull, once Elias's lullaby, had become the soundtrack to his unraveling sanity. It was no longer the gentle sigh of the wanderer breathing. It was the groan of something ancient and malevolent stirring within its timbers. For 5 years, the 40-foot sailboat had been his refuge, a self-imposed exile from the cacophony of land. He'd traded the suffocating press of city life for the boundless horizon, the shrill cries of urban sirens for the lonely shriek of gulls, the unyielding concrete for the yielding embrace of the waves. He'd sought solace in solitude, a communion with the raw, untamed power of the ocean. He had found something else entirely. The initial disturbances were like phantom limbs, sensations that flickered at the edge of perception, easily dismissed by a mind accustomed to the quirks of a solitary life at sea. A whisper in the rigging when the canvas hung limp and lifeless, a shadow that danced in his peripheral vision as the sun bled crimson into the western sky. He'd attributed them to the play of light and shadow on the water, the wind's mischievous games, the overactive imagination of a man alone with his thoughts for too long. But the whispers grew more insistent, morphing into discernible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very planks beneath his feet. The shadows solidified, lingering just a fraction too long, their shapes vaguely humanoid before dissolving into the vastness. The Wanderer, a vessel with a proud history etched into its weathered planks, had been Elias's obsession. He'd poured his heart and soul, and a considerable portion of his savings, into her restoration. Each meticulously polished brass fitting gleamed like a captured star. Each freshly varnished plank whispered tales of the sea's embrace. He had believed he was breathing new life into an old soul. Instead, he now suspected he had awakened something that had lain dormant for decades, perhaps centuries, within the boat's very fabric. The familiar wood, once warm and comforting, now felt cold and clammy to the touch, vibrating with a low, persistent thrum that resonated deep within the hull, a subtle tremor that intensified with the encroaching darkness. One starless evening, anchored in the hushed stillness of a secluded cove, nestled along the rugged Maine coastline, the unsettling undercurrent of dread surged into a palpable wave of terror. The air hung thick and heavy, pregnant with an unspoken anticipation. The usual symphony of the night, the gentle slap of water against the hull, the distant cry of a loon, was replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of Elias's own heart. Below deck, the soft golden glow of the oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls as he tried to lose himself in the pages of a worn novel. But the words blurred before his eyes, his focus fractured by an acute sense of unease. This was a slow, deliberate scratch. Scratch, scratch emanating from directly above his head, from within the very fabric of the cabin roof. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed, straining to decipher the source. He told himself it was a branch, dragged across the deck by an errant gust of wind, despite the utter stillness of the night. Perhaps a large seabird, its talons scraping against the fiberglass? But the sound possessed an unnerving intentionality, a methodical persistence that felt chillingly human. He ascended the companionway stairs with agonizing slowness, each creaking step amplifying the frantic rhythm of his heart. His hand trembled as he gripped the railing, his eyes scanning the moonless deck with the beam of his flashlight. Nothing. The smooth expanse of fiberglass reflected the light, utterly undisturbed. The intricate network of rigging stood stark against the inky sky, swaying gently in a breeze he couldn't feel. He circled the deck twice, his beam probing every corner, every shadow, finding nothing that could account for the terrifying sound. Back in the cramped confines of the cabin, the scratching started again, fainter now, almost a taunt. It seemed to be moving, tracing a path across the ceiling, just inches above his head as he lay rigid in his bunk, staring into the darkness. The sound burrowed its way into his consciousness, a relentless assault on his sanity. Sleep offered no respite, his dreams filled with amorphous, malevolent shapes swirling beneath the dark, churning surface of the sea. The following days unfolded in a disquieting rhythm of normalcy, punctuated by the increasingly bizarre. Footsteps echoed on the deck above him in the dead of night, heavy and deliberate, when he knew with absolute certainty that he was the only living soul aboard. The distinct, cloying smell of salt, sharp and metallic, like the lingering scent of old blood, would suddenly permeate the air in the galley, only to vanish moments later without a trace. His meticulously organized tools would be inexplicably moved. A wrench he'd laid beside the engine, now nestled amongst the fishing tackle in the cockpit locker. A well-loved copy of Moby Dick, left open on the saloon table, would be found closed, resting on his pillow in his bunk. He clung to logic, desperately seeking rational explanations for the escalating strangeness. The boat was old. The timbers shifted with the changing temperatures. The sea played tricks on the senses, distorting sounds and perceptions. The crushing weight of loneliness could warp even the most grounded mind. But the insidious feeling of being watched, of a presence lurking just beyond the veil of his awareness, grew stronger with each passing hour, each unexplained event. One still afternoon, while meticulously examining the hull below the waterline for any signs of fouling, his fingers brushed against something utterly inexplicable. A series of faint scratches, far too deep to be caused by barnacles or drifting debris, were etched into the smooth paint near the keel. They were arranged in a bizarre, almost circular pattern, and they looked disturbingly fresh. He ran his hand over them again and again, a primal shiver tracing a cold path down his spine. What force could have created such precise, deliberate markings? The sandy bottom of their anchorage was clear of any rocks or sharp objects. He began to meticulously document every anomaly in the ship's log, his neat script gradually devolving into a frantic scrawl. He noted the exact time, the precise location on the boat, and every minute detail of each unsettling occurrence. He clung to the hope that by recording these events, he could somehow discern a logical pattern, a rational explanation that would dispel the encroaching darkness that threatened to engulf his mind. But the entries, stark and unwavering in their strangeness, only painted a terrifying portrait of a reality that defied logic. Day 1742, faint rhythmic scratching directly above bunk. 3:17. Absolute stillness, no wind whatsoever. Calm seas, no discernible movement of the boat. Day 1745. Strong metallic smell, akin to old blood mixed with brine, permeated the galley at 1900 hours. Vanished abruptly within 3 minutes. No apparent source. Day 1748. Heavy footsteps on the teak deck above at dawn, just as the first light broke. Checked immediately. No one on deck. No signs of entry or disturbance. Day 1751. A series of deep, circular scratches discovered on the hull near the keel during routine inspection. Origin entirely unknown, appear freshly made. The profound isolation, once a cherished aspect of his seafaring life, now pressed down on him like a suffocating shroud. The endless, shimmering expanse of the ocean, once a symbol of boundless freedom, had transformed into a vast, empty prison, each horizon a stark reminder of his utter solitude. He found himself talking to the wanderer, his voice a low, desperate murmur in the echoing silence of the cabin. He'd pat the wooden bulkheads, whispering reassurances, as if the boat itself, this inanimate object, could somehow offer him solace, could ward off the unseen terror that was tightening its grip. One tempestuous night, seeking refuge in a small rocky cove as a ferocious nor'easter howled through the rigging, the strange occurrences escalated into a terrifying assault on his senses. The wanderer bucked and groaned violently in the mountainous swells, the wind screaming through the mast like a banshee. Rain lashed against the hull with the relentless fury of 1,000 tiny fists. Below deck, the oil lamp swung wildly, casting grotesque, distorted shadows that danced in macabre unison with the storm. Then, cutting through the roar of the wind and the crash of the waves, he heard it. A low, guttural moan, seemingly emanating from the very heart of the boat, from within the ancient timbers themselves. It was a sound of profound sorrow, of an agony that echoed through the ages. It vibrated through the floorboards, up his spine, and into the deepest recesses of his soul, leaving him trembling with an inexplicable dread. He scrambled out of his bunk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grip the smooth metal. "Hello?" he croaked, his voice a pathetic whisper swallowed by the tempestuous symphony outside. Silence. Then the moan again, closer this time, resonating just outside his cabin door, as if the source of the anguish was mere inches away. He backed away slowly, his flashlight beam jerking erratically across the damp, creaking bulkheads. The air in the small cabin grew suddenly, inexplicably cold, a bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the icy rain lashing the hull. He could see his own breath misting in the flickering lamplight, a ghostly exhalation in the confined space. Suddenly, a series of sharp, frantic knocks erupted from the hull, just inches from where he stood, pressed against the cold, damp wood. Bang, bang, bang. They were violent, desperate, as if something was trapped beneath the waterline, clawing frantically to break free, to gain entry into his fragile sanctuary. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose floorboard, sending him sprawling. He scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling, teetering on the brink of utter panic. This was not the natural settling of an old boat. This was not the wind playing tricks. This was something else, something sentient, something alive in a way that defied understanding. He lunged for the companionway, a desperate instinct driving him towards the relative openness of the storm-lashed deck, even as his rational mind screamed at the folly of seeking refuge in the heart of the tempest. As he reached the top of the narrow stairs, a shadow fell across the opening, blocking the faint light filtering from the oil lamp below. It was tall and impossibly gaunt, its form indistinct in the flickering light, yet undeniably present, a dark silhouette against the chaotic backdrop of the storm. A wave of icy dread, so profound it felt physically paralyzing, washed over him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even scream. The shadow seemed to sway slightly, a slow, deliberate movement, and then a long skeletal finger, impossibly thin and pale, curled around the edge of the companionway opening. The nail was long and black, like polished obsidian. The sight shattered the last vestiges of his control. He finally found his voice, a strangled, animalistic gasp that was instantly swallowed by the howling wind. He recoiled, stumbling back down the stairs, retreating into the suffocating confines of the small cabin. The horrifying image of that spectral finger burned indelibly into his mind's eye. He slammed the cabin door shut with a desperate force, the flimsy latch offering little comfort against the unseen terror that was now undeniably on his boat with him. He fumbled frantically with the heavy toolbox he kept for engine repairs, dragging it across the wooden floor and wedging it against the door. A futile gesture, he knew, against a presence that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The moaning started again, closer now, more insistent, laced with an unbearable sorrow that tugged at the edges of his sanity. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, the thin wooden walls, the creaking floorboards, the low ceiling pressing down on him. The boat itself vibrated with a palpable, malevolent energy, a tangible aura of dread that filled the small space. He huddled in the darkest corner, his knees drawn tightly to his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended rational fear. He thought of all the forgotten lore he'd once dismissed as fanciful tales spun by lonely sailors, stories of ghost ships sailing eternally through fog-choked waters, of phantom mariners forever bound to their watery graves. Now, these stories seemed terrifyingly real, no longer mere superstitions, but grim warnings he had foolishly ignored. Had the Wanderer, in its long and storied past, carried something more than just cargo and crew? Had he, in his naive pursuit of solitude, unknowingly awakened a slumbering darkness, invited a malevolent entity into his floating sanctuary? Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each marked by the relentless moaning that seemed to seep into his very bones, the subtle but persistent scraping sounds that echoed from unseen corners, the chilling sensation of unseen eyes watching him from the oppressive darkness. The storm outside eventually began to subside, the furious wind gradually dying down to a mournful whisper, the violent rocking of the boat easing to a gentle sway. But the terror within the Wanderer remained a cold, suffocating presence that refused to dissipate with the dawn. As the first pale tendrils of morning light finally seeped through the small porthole, painting the cabin in hues of gray and sickly yellow, the sounds began to fade. The heart-wrenching moaning softened to a faint, whimpering sigh, the unsettling scraping ceased altogether. The oppressive cold that had gripped the cabin slowly began to recede, leaving behind a lingering chill that felt more than just atmospheric. Elias remained huddled in the corner, a broken figure paralyzed by fear, afraid to move, afraid of what he might find if he dared to break the stillness. Finally, as the first weak rays of sunlight slanted through the grimy glass of the porthole, he cautiously pushed the heavy toolbox away from the door and crept out, his body stiff and aching, his senses screaming in protest. The cabin was eerily still. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence, a lingering residue of the night's terror, but the overt activity had ceased. He moved with agonizing slowness, his senses on high alert, every creak of the boat sending a fresh jolt of fear through him. Everything appeared normal, yet subtly, disturbingly wrong. A book lay askew on the shelf, its pages slightly ruffled. A navigational chart he had carefully rolled and stowed was now partially unfurled on the table, as if someone had been studying his intended course. He forced himself to venture onto the deck, the morning air biting against his clammy skin. The Wanderer looked as it always did in the pale light of dawn, the morning dew clinging to the intricate rigging like a million tiny diamonds, the familiar cries of seagulls circling overhead a stark contrast to the unholy sounds of the night. But the suffocating feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a weight in the air that spoke of an unseen observer. He had to see the hull. He had to know if the circular scratches were still there, a tangible confirmation of the night's terror. He knelt by the railing, peering over the side. There they were, stark white against the deep blue paint, their unnatural symmetry, a chilling testament to something beyond the realm of earthly forces. He reached out a trembling hand and ran his fingers over them. They felt strangely cold, radiating a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that he could not stay. The Wanderer was no longer his sanctuary, his escape. It had become something else, something tainted, something profoundly haunted. He had to get back to land, back to the reassuring normalcy of human contact, back to the solid, unmoving earth beneath his feet. He started the engine, the familiar rumble, a small, fragile comfort in the oppressive silence that still clung to the boat. As he slowly steered the Wanderer out of the sheltered cove, he glanced back at the rugged shoreline. The trees stood like silent, watchful sentinels, their long shadows stretching across the still water in the pale morning light. He couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that something was still watching him, its unseen gaze following his every move. From the dark depths of the cove, from within the very timbers of the Wanderer itself. The journey back to the small coastal port was an agonizingly slow crawl against a tide of mounting dread. Every creak of the aging boat, every splash of a wave against the hull, sent fresh shivers of terror down his spine. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously towards the dark opening of the companionway, half expecting to see that gaunt, shadowy figure lurking in the dim light. He reached the marina in a state of near-total collapse, his nerves frayed, his mind teetering on the edge of a complete breakdown. He tied up the Wanderer with trembling hands and practically stumbled onto the solid ground of the dock, his legs shaky and unsteady beneath him. He didn't look back at the boat. He couldn't bear to. He spent the next few days in a cheap, anonymous motel room, the mundane sounds of traffic and distant televisions a jarring but strangely welcome change from the oppressive silence of the sea. He tried to explain what had happened to the grizzled old harbor master, a man who had spent his entire life on the water and claimed to have seen his share of strange things. The old man listened patiently, his weathered face impassive, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he puffed on his pipe. But his only advice was cryptic and unsettling. Sometimes the sea keeps its secrets sun. Things out there, they ain't meant to be understood. Best not to pry too deep. Elias knew he could never step foot on the Wanderer again. The mere thought of being confined within its haunted hull filled him with a primal terror he had never imagined possible. He put her up for sale, listing her at a ridiculously low price, desperate to sever all ties with the cursed vessel. The boat sold surprisingly quickly to a young, enthusiastic couple, their eyes bright with the promise of adventure and a life of freedom on the open sea. Elias wanted to warn them, but all he could do was give a slight grin of relief as the couple sailed off,